How's it going today, guys? Baby2 here. We got a little bit more of a serious video. I was asking a friend for a recommendation for what should be the video for the second day of Davy Madness, second day of March. He gave a pretty solid recommendation. Like I said, it's going to be a little bit more of a serious video today. I'm going to be reading pretty much the entire Wikipedia article of the Armenian Genocide, live, uncut, raw footage. And at the end, I'm going to give my genuine opinion on it and give like my thoughts. Apparently, the Armenian genocide is something that a surprising amount of people do not know about, and he thought that it would be really interesting to get my opinion on it. So yeah, we're gonna do that, and we're gonna see what happened. I've never heard of this before. Genuinely, I've never heard of it. Apparently, a lot of people haven't. And apparently, shit that happened there was extraordinarily insane and fucked up. So, that's what we're going to do today. Let's start it here on the Wikipedia page. Grab a nice snack, cup of coffee, piece of rolls, cigarette, whatever you got to do. But today we are reading and talking about the Armenian Genocide. I'm going to be reading out loud, not in my head, obviously. Alright, so we have Armenian Genocide from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. Shout out Wikipedia, goat it. The Armenian Genocide was the systemic destruction of the Armenian people and identity in the Ottoman Empire during World War I, spearheaded by the Ruling Committee of Union Progress (CUP). It was implemented primarily through the mass murder of around 1 million Armenians during death marches to the Syrian desert and forced Islamization of others, primarily women and children. Before World War I, Armenians occupied a somewhat protected but subordinate place in Ottoman society. Large-scale massacres of Armenians had occurred in the 1890s and 1909. The Ottoman Empire suffered a series of multiple defeats and territorial losses, especially during the 1912 to 1913 Balkan Wars. They sparked fear among the CUP leaders that the Armenians, whose homeland in Anatolia they considered the Turkish nation's last refuge, would seek independence. Their invasion of Russia and Persian territory in 1914, Ottoman paramilitaries massacred local Armenians. Ottoman, le- Ottoman leaders took isolated instances of Armenian resistance as evidence of a widespread rebellion and decided to permanently forestall the possibility of Armenian autonomy or independence. On the 24th of April 1915, Ottoman authorities arrested and deported hundreds of Armenian intellectuals and leaders from Constantinople at the orders of the Talat Pasha. An estimated 800,000 to 1.2 Armenians were sent to death marches to the Syrian desert in 1915 and 1960, driven forward by paramilitary escorts. The deportees were deprived of food and water and subjected to robbery, rape, and massacres. Survivors were dispersed into concentration camps in 1916. In 1916, another wave of massacres was ordered, leaving about 200,000 deportees alive by the end of the war. Around 100,000 to 200,000 Armenian women and children were forcibly converted to Islam and integrated into Muslim households. Massacres and ethnic cleansing of Armenian survivors continued through the Turkish War of Independence after World War I, carried out by the Turkish nationalists. Regarded as the apex of horrors conceivable before World War II, the genocide destroyed more than 2,000 years of Armenian civilization in eastern Anatolia, alongside the genocides of Assyrians and Syriac and Greek Orthodox Christians, and enabled the creation of an ethno-nationalist Turkish state, the Republic of Turkey. The Turkish government maintains that the deportation of Armenians was a legitimate action that cannot be described as genocide. As of 2025, 34 countries have recognized the genocide, concurring with the academic consensus. Okay, I'm going to the right here. Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. The presence of Armenians in Anatolia has been documented since the 6th century BCE, about 1500 years before the arrival of Turkmens under the Seljuk dynasty. The Kingdom of Armenia adopted Christianity as its national religion in the 4th century CE, establishing the Armenian Apostolic Church I don't know, I'm not going to try to pronounce that. Following the end of the Byzantine Empire, in 1453, two Islamic empires, the Ottoman Empire and the Iranian Safavid Empire, contested western Armenia, which was permanently separated from eastern Armenia. Held by the Safavids, by the 1639 Treaty of Zuhab, the Ottoman was multi-ethnic and multi-religious, and its millet system offered non-Muslims a subordinate but protected place in society. Sharia law encoded Islamic superiority but guaranteed proper rights and freedom of worship to non-Muslims in exchange for special tax. On the eve of World War I in 1914, around 2 million Armenians lived in the Ottoman territory, mostly in Anatolia, a region with a total population of 15 to 17.5 million, according to the Armenian Patriarchate's estimates for 1913 and 1914. There were 2,925 Armenian towns and villages in the Ottoman Empire, of which 2,084 were in the Armenian highlands, adjacent to the Russian border. Armenians were a minority in most places where they lived, alongside Turkish and Kurdish Muslim and Greek Orthodox Christian neighbors. According to the Patriarchate's figure, 215,131 Armenians lived in urban areas, especially Constantinople, Smyrna, and eastern Thrace. Although most Ottoman Armenians were peasant farmers, they were overrepresented in comments as middleman minorities. Despite the wealth of some Armenians, their overall political power was low, making them especially vulnerable. Armenians in the eastern provinces lived in semi-feudal conditions and commonly encountered forced labor, illegal taxation, and unpunished crimes against them, including robberies, murders, and sexual assaults. Beginning in 1839, the Ottoman government issued a series of reforms to centralize power and equalize the status of Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion. The reforms to equalize the status of non-Muslims were strongly opposed by Islamic clergy and Muslims in general, and remained mostly theoretical. Because of the abolition of the Kurdish Emirates in the mid-19th century, the Ottoman government began to directly tax Armenian peasants who had previously paid taxes only to Kurdish landlords. The latter continued to exact levies illegally, not against. From the mid-19th century, Armenians faced large-scale land usurpation. As a consequence of the sedentarization of Kurdish tribes and the arrival of Muslim refugees and immigrants, mainly Circassians, following the Russo-Circassian War in 1876 when Sultan Abdul Hamid II came to power. The state began to confiscate Armenian-owned land in the eastern provinces and give it to Muslim immigrants as a part of the systematic policy to reduce the Armenian population of these areas. This policy lasted until World War I. These conditions led to a substantial decline in the population of the Armenian highlands. 300,000 Armenians left the empire, and others moved to towns. Some Armenians joined revolutionary political parties, of which the most influential was Armenian Revolutionary Federation, ARF, founded in 1890. These parties primarily sought reform within the empire and found only limited support from Ottoman Armenians. Russia's decisive victory in the 1877 to 1878 war forced the Ottoman Empire to cede parts of eastern Anatolia, the Balkans, and Cyprus. Under international pressure at the 1878 Congress of Berlin, the Ottoman government agreed to carry out reforms and guarantee the physical safety of its Armenian subjects, but there was no enforcement mechanism. Conditions continued to worsen. The Congress of Berlin marked the emergence of the Armenian question in international diplomacy, as Armenians were for the first time used by the great powers to interfere in Ottoman politics. Although Armenians had been called the loyal millet, in contrast to Greeks and others who had previously challenged Ottoman rule, the authorities began to perceive Armenians as a threat after 1878. In 1891, Abdul Hamid created the Hamadai regiments from Kurdish tribes, allowing them to act with impunity against Armenians. From 1895 to 1896, the empire saw widespread massacres. At least 100,000 Armenians were killed, primarily by Ottoman soldiers and mobs let loose by the authorities. Many Armenian villages were forcibly converted to Islam. Jesus. The Ottoman state bore ultimate responsibility for the killings, whose purpose was violently restoring the previous social order in which Christians would unquestionably accept Muslim supremacy, and forcing Armenians to emigrate, thereby decreasing their numbers. The Young Turk Revolution. Abdul Hamid's despotism? Despotism. I'm going to say that. Abdul Hamid's despotism prompted the formation of an opposition movement, the Young Turks, which sought to overthrow him and restore the 1876 constitution of the Ottoman Empire, which he had suspended in 1877. One faction of the Young Turks was Secret and Revolutionary Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, based in Salonika, from which the charismatic conspirator Mehmed Talat, later Talat Pasha, emerged as a leading member. Although skeptical of a growing exclusionary Turkish nationalism in the Young Turk movement, the ARF decided to ally with the CUP in December 1907. In 1908, the CUP came to power in the Young Turk Revolution, which began with a string of CUP assassinations of leading officials in Macedonia. Abdul Hamid was forced to reinstate the 1876 constitution and restore the Ottoman parliament, which was celebrated by Ottomans of all ethnicities and religions. Security improved in parts of the eastern provinces after 1908, and the CUP took steps to reform the local gendarmerie. Although tensions remained high, despite an agreement to reverse the land usurpation of the previous decades in the 1910 Salonika Accord between the ARF and the CUP, the latter made no efforts to carry this out. In early 1909, an unsuccessful counter-coup was launched by conservatives and some liberals who opposed the CUP's increasingly representative governance. When news of the counter-coup reached Adana, armed Muslims attacked the Armenian quarter, and Armenians returned fire. Ottoman soldiers did not protect Armenians and instead armed the rioters. Between 20,000 and 25,000 people, mostly Armenians, were killed in Adana and nearby towns. Unlike the 1890 massacres, the events were not organized by the central government, but instigated by local officials, intellectuals, and Islamic clerics, including CUP supporters in Adana. I'm talking way too much. I'm reading too much out loud. Like this story is giving me anxiety. Although the massacres went unpunished, the ARF continued to hope that reforms to improve security and restore lands were forthcoming until late 1912, when they broke with the CUP and appealed to the European powers. On February 8, 1914, the CUP reluctantly agreed to reforms brokered by Germany that provided the appointment of 2 European inspectors for the entire Ottoman East and putting the Hamadai regiments in reserve. CUP leaders feared that these reforms, which were never implemented, could lead to partition and cited them as a reason for the elimination of the Armenian population in 1915. Jeez Louise. This is a lot. This is a lot. This is a heap, and it genuinely is kind of making me anxious. This is very very damning information I've never heard of. I have a pretty broad imagination, so reading this, I'm just picturing everything that's happening, and it sounds genuinely fucking awful. The 1912 First Balkan War resulted in the loss of almost all the empire's European territory and the mass expulsion of Muslims from the Balkans. Ottoman Muslim society was incensed by the atrocities committed against Balkan Muslims, intensifying anti-Christian sentiment and leading to a desire for revenge. Blame for the loss was assigned to all Christians, including Ottoman Armenians, many of whom had fought on the Ottoman side. The Balkan Wars put an end to the Ottomanist movement for pluralism and coexistence. Instead, the CUP turned to an increasingly radical Turkish nationalism to preserve the empire. CUP leaders such as Talat and Enver Pasha came to blame came to blame non-Muslim population. Concentrations in strategic areas for many of the empire's problems, concluding by mid-1914 there were internal tumors to be excised. Of these Ottoman Armenians were considered the most dangerous because CUP leaders feared that their homeland in Anatolia, claimed as the last refuge of the Turkish nation, would break away from the empire as the Balkans had. In January 1913, the CUP launched another coup, installed a one-party state, and strictly repressed all real or perceived internal enemies. After the coup, the CUP shifted the demography of border areas, resettling Balkan Muslim refugees while coercing Christians to immigrate. Immigrants were promised property that had belonged to Christians. When part of the eastern Thrace were reoccupied by the Ottoman Empire during the Second Balkan War in mid-1913, there was a campaign of looting and intimidation against Greeks and Armenians, forcing many to immigrate. Around 150,000 Greek Orthodox from the Aegean coast were forcibly deported in May and June 1914 by Muslim bandits, who were secretly backed by the CUP and sometimes joined by the regular army. Historian Matthias Bjornlund states that the perceived success of the Greek deportations allowed CUP leaders to envision even more radical policies as yet another extension of a policy of social engineering through Turkification. Dude, this is a lot. Ottoman entry into World War I. A few days after the outbreak of World War I, the CUP concluded an alliance with Germany on the 2nd of August 1914. The same month, CUP representatives went to an ARF conference, demanding, in the event of war with Russia, the ARF incite Russian Armenians to intervene on the Ottoman side. Instead, the delegates resolved that Armenians should fight for the countries of their citizenship. During its war preparations, the Ottoman government recruited thousands of prisoners to join the paramilitary special organization, which initially focused on stirring up revolts among Muslims behind Russian lines, beginning before the empire officially entered the war. On the 29th of October 1914, the empire entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers by launching a surprise attack on Russian ports in the Black Sea. Many Russian Armenians were enthusiastic about the war, but Ottoman Armenians were more ambivalent, afraid that supporting Russia would bring retaliation. Organization of Armenian volunteer units by Russian Armenians, later joined by some Ottoman Armenian deserters, further increased Ottoman suspicions against their Armenian population. Excuse me. Wartime requisitions were often corrupt and arbitrary, and disproportionately targeted Greeks and Armenians. Armenian leaders urged young men to accept conscription into the army, but many soldiers of all ethnicities and religions deserted due to difficult conditions and concern for their families. At least 10% of Ottoman Armenians were mobilized, leaving their communities bereft of fighting-age men, and therefore largely unable to organize armed resistance to deportation in 1915. During the Ottoman invasion of Russia and Persian territory, the special organization massacred local Armenians, Assyrian Syriac Christians. Beginning in 1914, provincial governors of Van, Bitlis, and Erzurum sent many telegrams to the central government, pressing for more severe measures against the Armenians, both regionally and throughout the empire. These requests were endorsed by the central government already before 1915. Armenian civil servants were dismissed from their posts in late 1914 and early 1915. In February 1915, the CUP leaders decided to disarm Armenians serving in the army and transfer them to labor battalions. Really? So the people that they were rocking with the entire time just said, fuck you. The Armenian soldiers in labor battalions were systemically executed, although many skilled workers were spared until 1916. Jesus Christ. On set. Minister of War Enver Pasha took over the command of the Ottoman armies for the invasion of Russian territory and tried to encircle the Russian Caucasus army at the Battle of Sarakamish, fought from December 1914 to January 1915. Unprepared for the harsh winter conditions, his forces were routed, losing more than 60,000 men. The retreating Ottoman army destroyed dozens of Ottoman Armenian villages in Bitlis Vilayet, massacring their inhabitants. Enver publicly blamed his defeat on Armenians who he claimed had actively sided with the Russians, a theory that became a consensus amongst CUP leaders. Reports of local incidences, such as weapon caches, severed telegraph lines, and occasional killings, confirmed pre-existing beliefs about Armenian treachery and fueled paranoia among CUP leaders that a coordinated Armenian conspiracy was plotting against the empire. Discounting contrary reports that most Armenians were loyal to the CUP, decided that the Armenians had to be eliminated to save the empire. Massacres of Armenian men were occurring in the vicinity of Baskail and Van Viliat from December 1914. ARF leaders attempted to keep the situation calm, warning that even justifiable self-defense could lead to escalation of killing. The governor of Jivet Bey ordered the Armenians of Van to hand over their arms in April 18, 1915, creating a dilemma. If they obeyed, the Armenians expected to be killed, but if they refused, it would provide a pretext for massacres. Armenians fortified themselves in Van and repelled the Ottoman attack that began on April 20th. During the siege, Armenians in surrounding villages were massacred at Jivet's orders. The Russians captured Van on May 18th, finding 55,000 corpses in the province. Jesus fucking Christ. About half its pre-war Armenian population. Jivet's forces proceeded to Bitlis and attacked Armenian Assyrian Syriac villages. The men were killed immediately. Many women and children were kidnapped by local Kurds, and others marched away to be killed later. By the end of June, there were only a dozen Armenians in the vilayet. Jesus Christ. First deportations of Armenians were proposed by Jamal Pasha, the commander of the Fourth Army, in February 1915 and targeted Armenian in February 1915 and targeted Armenian Cilicia, specifically Alexandretta, Dyotiol, Adana, Hajin, Zeytun, and Sis, who were relocated to the area around Konya in central Anatolia. In late March of early April, the CUP's Central Committee decided on the large-scale removal of Armenians from areas near the front lines. During the night of 23rd to 24th of April 1915, hundreds of Armenian political activists, intellectuals, and community leaders were rounded up in Constantinople and across the empire. This order from Talat, intended to eliminate the Armenian leadership and anyone capable of organizing resistance, eventually resulted in the murder of most of those arrested. The same day, Talat banned all Armenian political organizations and ordered that the Armenians who had previously been removed from Cilicia be deported again from central Anatolia. They would likely have survived to the Syrian desert. Jesus Christ. Fucking hell. Systemic deportations. It's the aims. During World War One, the CUP, whose central goal was to preserve the Ottoman Empire, came to identify Armenian civilians as an existential threat. CUP leaders held Armenians, including women and children, collectively guilty for betraying the empire, a belief that was crucial to deciding on genocide in early 1915. At the same time, the war provided an opportunity to enact what Talat called the definitive solution to the Armenian question. The CUP wrongly believed that the Russian Empire sought to annex eastern Anatolia and order the genocide in large part to prevent this eventuality. The genocide was intended to permanently eliminate any possibility that Armenians could achieve autonomy or independence in the empire's eastern provinces. Ottoman records show the government aimed to reduce Armenians to no more than 5% of the local population in the sources of deportation and 10% in the destination areas. This goal could not be accomplished without mass murder. I almost got teary-eyed right there. The deportation of Armenians and resettlement of Muslims in their land was part of a broader project intended to permanently restructure the demographics of Anatolia. Armenian homes, businesses, and land were preferentially allocated to Muslims from outside the empire, nomads, and the estimated 800,000 largely Kurdish Ottoman subjects displaced because of the war with Russia. Resettled Muslims were spread out, typically limited to 10% in any area, among larger Turkish populations so that they would lose their distinctive characteristics such as non-Turkish languages or nomadism. These migrants were exposed to harsh conditions and in some cases violence or restriction from leaving their new villages. The ethnic cleansing of Anatolia, the Armenian Genocide, Assyrian Genocide, and expulsion of Greeks after World War I paved the way for the formation of an ethno-national Turkish state. In September 1918, Talat emphasized that regardless of the losing war, he had succeeded at transforming Turkey to a nation-state in Anatolia. Deportation amounted to a death sentence. The authorities planned for and intended the death of the deportees. Deportation was only carried out behind the front lines, where no active rebellion existed and was only possible in the absence of widespread resistance. Armenians who lived in the war zone were instead killed in massacres, although ostensibly undertaken for security reasons. The deportation and murder of Armenians did not grant the empire any military advantage and actually undermined the Ottoman war effort. The empire faced a dilemma between its goals of eliminating Armenians and its practical need for their labor. Those Armenians retained for their skills, in particular for manufacturing and war industries, were indispensable to the logistics of the Ottoman army. By late 1915, the CUP had extinguished Armenian existence from eastern Anatolia. Administrative organization. Okay. On the 23rd of May, 1915, the Talat ordered the deportation of all Armenians in Van, Bidlis, and Erzurum. To grant a cover of legality to the deportation already well underway in the eastern provinces and Cilicia, the Council of Ministers approved the temporary law of deportation, which allowed authorities to deport anyone deemed suspect. On the 21st of June, Talat ordered the deportation of all Armenians throughout the empire, even Adrianople, 2,000 kilometers, 1,200 miles from the Russian front, following the elimination of Armenian population in eastern Anatolia in August 1915. The Armenians of western Anatolia and European Turkey were targeted for deportation. Some areas with a very low Armenian population and some cities including Constantinople, were partially spared. Overall, national, regional, and local levels of governments cooperated with the CUP in the preparation of genocide. The Directorate for the Settlement of Tribes and Immigrants, IAMM, coordinated the deportation and resettlement of Muslim immigrants in the vacant houses and lands. The IAMM, under the control of Talat's Ministry of the Interior, and the special organization which took orders directly from the CUP Central Committee all closely coordinated their activities. A dual-track system was used to communicate orders. Those for deportation of Armenians were communicated to the provincial governors through official channels, but orders of a criminal character, such as those calling for annihilation, were sent through party channels and destroyed upon receipt. Deportation convoys were mostly escorted by gendarmes or local militia. The killings near the front lines were carried out by special organization, and those farther away also involved local militias, bandits, gendarmes, or Kurdish tribes, depending on the area. Within the area controlled by the Third Army, which held eastern Anatolia, the army was only involved in genocidal atrocities in the vilayets of Van, Erzurum, and Bidlis. Many perpetrators came across the Caucasus, Chechens and Circassians, who identified the Armenians with their Russian oppressors. Nomadic Kurds committed many atrocities during the genocide, but settled Kurds only rarely did so. Perpetrators had several motives, including ideology, revenge, desire for Armenian property, and careerism. To motivate perpetrators, state-appointed imams encouraged the killing of Armenians, and killers were entitled to a third of Armenian movable property. Another third went to local authorities, and the last to the CUP. Embezzling beyond that was punished. Ottoman politicians and officials who opposed the genocide were dismissed or assassinated. The government decreed that any Muslim who harbored an Armenian against the will of authorities would be executed. Fucking Christ. Alright, this is kind of where we get into the soured meat and potatoes, I'm assuming. Death marches. Although the majority of the able-bodied Armenian men had been conscripted into the army, others deserted, paid the exemption tax, or fell outside the age range of conscription. Unlike the earlier massacres of the Ottoman Armenians in 1915, were not usually killed in their villages to avoid destruction of property or unauthorized looting. Instead, the men were usually separated from the rest of the deportees during the first few days and executed. Few resisted, believing it would put their families in greater danger. Boys above the age of 12, sometimes 15, were treated as adult men. Execution sites were chosen for proximity to major roads and rugged terrain, lakes, wells, and cisterns to facilitate the concealment of or disposal of corpses. The convoys would stop at a nearby transit camp, where the escorts would demand a ransom for the Armenians. Those unable to pay were murdered. Units of this special organization, often wearing gendarme uniforms, were stationed at the killing sites. Escorting gendarmes often did not participate in killing. At least 150,000 Armenians passed through the Erzincan from June 1915, where a series of transit camps were set up to control the flow of victims to the killing site at nearby Kama Gorge. Thousands of Armenians were killed near Lake Khazar, pushed by paramilitaries off the cliffs. Jesus fucking Christ. More than 500,000 Armenians passed through the the Ferinkiller Plain south of Malatya, one of the deadliest areas during the genocide. Arriving convoys having passed through the plain to approach the Kata highlands would have found gorges already filled with corpses from previous convoys. Many others were held in tributary valleys of the Tigris, Euphrates, and Murat, and systemically executed by the special organization. Armenians were often drowned by being tied together back to back before being thrown in the water, a method that was not used on women. Oh, thank fucking God. Authorities viewed disposal of bodies through rivers as cheap and efficient method, but it caused widespread pollution downstream. So many bodies floated down the Tigris and Euphrates that they sometimes blocked the rivers and needed to be cleared with explosives. Other rotting corpses became stuck to the riverbanks, and still others traveled as far as the Persian Gulf. The rivers remained polluted long after the massacre, causing epidemics downstream. Tens of thousands of Armenians died along the roads, and their bodies were buried hastily, or more often simply left beside the roads. The Ottoman government ordered the corpses to be cleared as soon as possible to prevent both photographic documentation and disease epidemics, but these orders were not uniformly followed. Women and children, who made up the great majority of deportees, were usually not executed immediately, but subjected to hard marches through mountainous terrain without food and water. Those who could not keep up were left to die or shot. During 1915, some were forced to walk as far as 1,000 kilometers, 620 miles, in the summer heat. Some deportees from western Anatolia were allowed to travel by rail. There was a distinction between the convoys from eastern Anatolia, which were eliminated almost in their entirety, and those from farther west, which made up most of the surviving to reach Syria. For example, around 99% of Armenians deported from Erzurum did not reach their destination. Fucking Christ. Alright. Islamization. Islamization. There we go. Islamization of the Armenians carried out as a systemic state policy involving the bureaucracy, police, judiciary, and clergy was a major structural component of the genocide. An estimated 100,000 to 200,000 Armenians were Islamized. 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 And it is estimated that as many as 2 million Turkish citizens in the early 21st century may have at least one Armenian grandparent. Some Armenians were allowed to convert to Islam and evade deportation, but the regime insisted on their destruction wherever their numbers exceed the 5 to 10% threshold, or there was a risk of them being able to preserve their nationality and culture. Take a minute right there. Talat Pasha personally authorized conversion of Armenians and carefully tracked down the loyalty of converted Armenians until the end of the war. Although the first and most important step was conversion to Islam, the process also required the eradication of Armenian names, language, and culture, and for women, immediate marriage to a Muslim. Although Islamization was the most feasible opportunity for survival, it also transgressed Armenian moral and social norms. The CUP allowed Armenian women to marry into Muslim households, as these women would lose their Armenian identity. Young women and girls were often appropriated as house servants or sex slaves. Some boys were abducted to work as forced laborers for Muslim individuals. Some children were forcibly seized, while others were sold or given up by their parents to save their lives. Special state-run orphanages were also set up with strict procedures intending to deprive their charges of an Armenian identity. Most Armenian children who survived the genocide endured exploitation, hard labor without pay, forced conversion to Islam, and physical and sexual abuse. Armenian women captured during the journey ended up in Turkish or Kurdish households. Those who were Islamized, I'm sorry, I keep fucking pronouncing this wrong, Islamized during the second phase of the genocide found themselves in an Arab or Bedouin environment. The rape, sexual abuse, and prostitution of Armenian women were all very common, although Armenian women tried to avoid sexual violence. Suicide was often the only alternative. Deportees were displayed naked in Damascus and sold as sex slaves in some areas, constituting an important source of income for accompanying gendarmes. Some were sold in Arabian slave markets to Muslim Hajj pilgrims and ended up as far away as Tunisia or Algeria. Confiscation of property. A secondary motivation for genocide was the destruction of the Armenian bourgeoisie to make room for a Turkish and Muslim middle class and build a statish national economy controlled by Muslim Turks. The campaign to Turkify the economy began in June 1914 with a law that obliged many non-Muslim merchants to hire Muslims. Following the deportations, the business of the victims were taken over by Muslims who were often incompetent, leading to economic difficulties. The genocide had catastrophic effects on the Ottoman economy. Muslims were disadvantaged by the deportation of skilled professionals, and entire districts fell into famine following their farmers' deportation. The Ottoman and Turkish governments passed a series of abandoned property laws to manage and redistribute property confiscated from Armenians, although the laws maintained that the state was simply administering the properties on behalf of the absent Armenians. There was no provision to return them to the owners. It was presumed that they had ceased to exist. I need to take a breather. There's a lot of fucked up shit. Jesus Christ. Historians Taner Akim and Umit Kurt argue that the Republic of Turkey and its legal system were built, in a sense, on the seizure of Armenian cultural, social, and economic wealth, and on the removal of the Armenian presence. The proceeds from the sale of confiscated property was often used to fund the deportation of Armenians and resettlement of Muslims. As well for army, militia, and other government spending, ultimately this formed much of the basis of the industry and economy of the post-1923 republic, endowing it with capital. The disposition and exile of Armenian competitors enabled many low-class Turks, i.e. peasantry, soldiers, and laborers, to rise to the middle class. Confiscation of Armenian assets continued into the second half of the 20th century, and in 2006 the National Security Council ruled that property records from 1915 must be kept closed to protect national security. Outside Istanbul, the traces of Armenian existence in Turkey, including churches and monasteries, libraries, gakars, and animal and place names, have been systemically erased, beginning during the war and continuing for decades afterwards. I've already seen a word I did not like. We're going to continue to read forward, though, because history shall not be forgotten. The first arrivals in this is destination, by the way. The first arrivals in mid 1915 were accommodated in Aleppo. From mid-November, the convoys were denied access to the city and redirected along the Baghdad Railway or the Euphrates towards Mosul. The first transit camp was established at Sibel, east of Aleppo. One convoy would arrive each day, while another would depart from Meskin or Deir ez-Zor. Dozens of concentration camps were set up in Syria and Upper Mesopotamia. By October 1915, some 870,000 deportees had reached Syria and Upper Mesopotamia. Most were repeatedly transferred between camps, being held in each camp for a few weeks until there were very few survivors. This strategy physically weakened the Armenians and spread disease so much that some camps were shut down in late 1915 due to the threat of disease spreading to the Ottoman military. In late 1915, the camps around Aleppo were liquidated and the survivors were forced to march to Ras Al Ain. The camps around Ras Al Ain were closed in early 1916 and the survivors sent to Deir ez-Zor. In general, Armenians were denied food and water during and after their forced march to the Syrian desert. Many died of starvation, exhaustion, or disease, especially dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia. Some local officials gave Armenians food, others took bribes to provide food and water. Aid organizations were officially barred from providing food to the deportees, although some circumvented these prohibitions. Survivors testified that some Armenians refused aid as they believed it would only prolong their suffering. The guards raped female prisoners and also allowed Bedouins to raid the camps at night for looting and rape. Some women were forced into marriage. Thousands of Armenian children were sold to childless Turks, Arabs, and Jews who would come to the camps to buy them from their parents. In the western Levant, governed by the Ottoman Fourth Army under Jamil Pasha, there were no concentration camps or large-scale massacres. Rather, Armenians were resettled and recruited to work for the war effort. They had to convert to Islam or face deportation to another area. I surely wouldn't be able to handle something like that. The ability of the Armenians to adapt and survive was greater than the perpetrators expected. A loosely organized Armenian-led resistance network based in Aleppo succeeding in helping many deportees, saving Armenian lives at the beginning of 1916. Some 500,000 deportees were alive in Syria and Mesopotamia. Afraid that surviving Armenians might return home after the war, Talat Pasha ordered a second wave of massacres in February 1916. Another wave of deportations targeted Armenians remaining in Anatolia. More than 200,000 Armenians were killed between March and October of 1916, often in remote areas near Deir ez-Zor and on parts of the Khabur Valley, where their bodies would not create a public health hazard. The massacres killed most of the Armenians who had survived the camp system. It's fucking all for nothing. International reaction. The Ottoman Empire tried to prevent journalists and photographers from documenting the atrocities, threatening them with arrest. Nevertheless, substantiated reports of mass killings were widely covered in Western newspapers. On the 24th of May, 1915, the Triple Entente, Russia, Britain, and France, formally condemned the Ottoman Empire for crimes against humanity and civilization, and threatened to hold the perpetrators accountable. Witness testimony was published in books such as The Treatment of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire and Ambassador Margenthal's Story, 1918, raising public awareness of the genocide. The German Empire was a military ally of the Ottoman Empire during World War I. German diplomats approved limited removals of Armenians in early 1915 and took no action against the genocide, which has been a source of controversy. Relief efforts were organized in dozens of countries to raise money for Armenian survivors by 1925. People in 49 countries were organizing Gold Rule Sundays, during which they consumed the diet of Armenian refugees to raise money for humanitarian efforts between 1915 and 1930. Near East Relief raised $110 million, $2.1 billion adjusted for inflation, for refugees from the Ottoman Empire. End of World War I. Intentional state-sponsored killing of Armenians mostly ceased by the end of January 1917. Although sporadic, massacres and starvation continued. Both contemporaries and later historians have estimated that around 1 million Armenians died during the genocide, with figures ranging from 600,000 to 1.5 million deaths. Between 800,000 and 1.2 Armenians were deported, and contemporaries estimated that by late 1916, only 200,000 were still alive. As the British Army advanced in 1917 and 1918 northward to the Levant, they liberated around 100,000 to 150,000 Armenians working for the Ottoman military under abysmal conditions, not including those held by Arab tribes. As a result of the Bolshevik Revolution and the subsequent separate peace with the Central Powers, the Russian army withdrew and Ottoman forces advanced into eastern Anatolia. The First Republic of Armenia was proclaimed in May 1918, at which time 50% of its population were refugees and 60% of its territory was under Ottoman occupation. Ottoman troops withdrew from parts of Armenia following the October 1918 Armistice of Mudros. From 1918 to 1920, Armenian militants committed revenge killings of thousands of Muslims, which had been cited as a retroactive excuse for genocide. In 1918, at least 200,000 people in Armenia, mostly refugees, died from starvation or disease, in part due to a Turkish blockade of food supplies, and the deliberate destruction of crops in eastern Armenia by Turkish troops both before and after the armistice. Armenians organized a coordinated effort known as Vorba Havak, the Gathering of Orphans, that reclaimed thousands of kidnapped and Islamized Armenian women and children. Armenian leaders abandoned traditional patrilineality to classify children born to Armenian women and their Muslim captors as Armenian. An orphanage in Alexandropol held 25,000 orphans, the largest number in the world. In 1920, the Armenian Patriarchate of Constantinople reported it was caring for 100,000 orphans, estimating that another 100,000 remained captive. The trials. Following the armistice, Allied governments championed the prosecution of Armenian genocide perpetrators. Grand Vizier Damat Farid Pasha publicly recognized that 800,000 Ottoman citizens of Armenian origin had died as a result of state policy, and stated that civilizations are shuddering, and forever will shudder in face of this tragedy. The post-war Ottoman government held the Ottoman Special Military Tribunal, which is sought to pin the Armenian genocide onto the CUP leadership, while exonerating the Ottoman Empire as a whole. Therefore, avoiding partition by the Allies, the court ruled that the crime of mass murder of Armenians was organized and carried out by the top leaders of CUP. 18 perpetrators, including Talat, Enver, and Jamal, were sentenced to death, of whom only 3 were ultimately executed, as the remainder had fled and were tried in absentia. The 1920 Treaty of Sevres, which awarded Armenia a large area in eastern Anatolia, eliminated the Ottoman government's purpose for holding the trials. Prosecution was hampered by a widespread belief among Turkish Muslims that the actions against the Armenians were not punishable crimes. Increasingly, the genocide was considered necessary and justified to establish a Turkish nation-state. On the 15th of March, 1921, Talat was assassinated in Berlin. as a part of a covert operation of the ARF to kill the perpetrators of Armenian genocide. The trial of his Hamitic killer, Sagaman Talaharin, focused on Talat's responsibility for genocide. Talarahin was acquitted by a German jury. Banger. Turkish War of Independence. The CUP regrouped as the Turkish nationalist movement to fight the Turkish War of Independence, relying on the support of perpetrators of the genocide and those who had profited from it. This movement saw the return of Armenian survivors as a mortal threat to its nationalist ambitions and the interests of its supporters. The return of survivors was therefore impossible in most of Anatolia, and thousands of Armenians who tried were murdered. Historian Ramon Kevorkian states that the War of Independence was intended to complete the genocide by finally eradicating Armenian, Greek, and Syriac survivors. In 1920, Kazim Karabekar, a Turkish general, invaded Armenia with orders to eliminate Armenia physically and politically. Nearly 100,000 Armenians were massacred in Transcaucasia by the Turkish army, and another 100,000 fled from Cilicia during the French war withdrawal. According to Kevorkian, only the Soviet occupation of Armenia prevented another genocide. Fuck. This is so fucking rough, man. The victorious nationalists subsequently declared the Republic of Turkey in 1923. CUP war criminals were granted immunity, and later that year the Treaty of Lausanne established Turkey's current borders and provided for the Greek population's expulsion. Its protection provisions for non-Muslim minorities had no enforcement mechanism and were disregarded in practice. Armenian survivors were left mainly in three locations. About 295,000 Armenians had fled to Russia-controlled territory during the genocide and ended up mostly in Soviet Armenia. An estimated 200,000 Armenian refugees settled in the Middle East, forming a new wave of the Armenian diaspora. In the Republic of Turkey, about 100,000 Armenians lived in Constantinople, and another 200,000 lived in the provinces, largely women and children who had been forcibly converted. Though Armenians in Constantinople faced discrimination, they were allowed to maintain their cultural identity, unlike those elsewhere in Turkey, who continued to face forced Islamization and kidnapping of girls after 1923. Between 1922 and 1929, the Turkish authorities eliminated surviving Armenians from southern Turkey, expelling thousands to French Mandate Syria. Legacy. According to historian Margaret Lavinia Anderson, the Armenian genocide reached an iconic status as the apex of horrors conceivable before World War II. It was described by contemporaries as the murder of a nation, race extermination, the greatest crime of the ages, and the blackest page in modern history. According to historian Stefan Ehrig, in Germany, the Nazis viewed post-1923 Turkey as a post-genocidal paradise and incorporated the Armenian genocide, its lessons, tactics, and benefits into their own worldview. Turkey. In the 1920s, Kurds and Alevis replaced Armenians as the perceived internal enemy of the Turkish state. Militarism, weak rule of law, and lack of minority rights, and especially the belief that Turkey is constantly under threat, thus justifying state violence, are among the main legacies of the genocide in Turkey. In post-war Turkey, the perpetrators of the genocide were hailed as martyrs of the national cause. Turkey's official denial of the Armenian genocide continues to rely on the CUP's justification of its actions. The Turkish government maintains that the mass deportation of Armenians was a legitimate action to combat an existential threat to the empire, but there was no intention to exterminate the Armenian people. The government's position is supported by the majority of Turkish citizens. Many Kurds, who themselves have suffered political repression in Turkey, have recognized and condemned the genocide. Bull fucking shit. The Turkish state perceives open discussion of the genocide as a threat to national security because of its connection with the foundation of the republic, and for decades strictly censored it. In 2002, the AK party came to power and relaxed censorship to a certain extent, and the profile of the issue was raised by the 2007 assassination of Hrant Dink, a Turkish Armenian journalist known for his advocacy and of reconciliation. Although the AK party softened the state denial rhetoric, describing Armenians as a part of the Ottoman Empire's war losses, during the 2010s political repression and censorship increased again. Turkey's century-long effort to prevent any recognition or mention of the genocide in foreign countries has included millions of dollars in lobbying as well as intimidation and threats. Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day is commemorated on April 24th each year in Armenia and abroad. The anniversary of deportation of Armenian intellectuals on 24th of April 1965. 100,000 Armenians protested in Yerevan, and diaspora Armenians demonstrated across the world in favor of recognition of the genocide and annexing land from Turkey. A memorial was completed 2 years later at Tis Tisitsur Nakaberd above Yerevan. Since 1988, Armenians and Turkic Azeris have been involved in a conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, an Armenian enclave internationally recognized as part of the Azerbaijan. Initially involving peaceful demonstrations by Armenians, the conflict turned violent and has featured massacres by both sides, resulting in the displacement of more than 500,000 people. During the conflict, the Azerbaijani and Armenian governments have regularly accused each other of plotting genocide. Azerbaijan has also joined the Turkish effort to deny the Armenian genocide international recognition. In response to continuing denial by the Turkish state, many Armenian diaspora activists have lobbied for international formal recognition of the Armenian genocide, an effort that has become a central concern of the Armenian diaspora. From the 1970s onwards, many countries avoided recognition to preserve good relations with Turkey. As of 2025, 34 UN member states have formally recognized the genocide, along with the Holy See and the European Parliament. Cultural depictions. After meeting Armenian survivors in the Middle East, Austrian Jewish writer Franz Werfel wrote The 40 Days of Musa Dagh, a fictionalized retelling of the successful Armenian uprising in Musa Dagh. As a warning of the dangers of Nazism, according to Erig, the book released in 1933 is amongst the most important works of 20th century literature to address genocide and is still considered essential reading for Armenians worldwide. I kind of want to get that book now. The genocide became a central theme in English language, Armenian American literature. The first film about the Armenian genocide, Ravashed Armenia, was released in 1919 as a fundraiser for Near East relief, based on the survival story of Aurora Mardeganyan, who played herself. Since then, more films about the genocide have been made, although it took several decades for any of them to reach a mass market audience. The abstract expressionist paintings of Arshal Gorky were influenced by his experience of the genocide. More than 200 memorials have been erected in 32 countries to commemorate the event. Archives and historiography. The genocide is extensively documented in the archives of Germany, Austria, and the United States, Russia, France, and the United Kingdom, as well as the Ottoman archives. Despite systemic purges of incriminating documents by Turkey, there are also thousands of eyewitness accounts from Western missionaries and Armenian survivors. Polish-Jewish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide in 1944, became interested in war crimes after reading about the 1921 trial of Sagaman Talarin for the assassination of Talat Pasha. Lemkin recognized the fate of the Armenians as one of the most significant genocides in the 20th century. almost all historians and scholars outside Turkey and an increasing number of Turkish scholars recognize the destruction of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire as genocide. That was the entire uh, that was the entire thing. Um, Whenever you read about a genocide, obviously you're not expecting good things. There were definitely a few moments there I felt like crying. I almost teared up. Also, a few moments reading what was happening, what had happened at that time gave me legitimate, really bad anxiety. Uh, my friend Tom, who recommended that I read this and give my opinion. Thanks for letting me know about this. I never knew about this. I feel like this is a very important part of world history. To give my opinion on it, I I'm speechless. I know I'm talking, but I'm speechless. I don't have anything in particular to say. This is legitimately. It baffles me how everybody and their mothers knows about the Holocaust, but nobody knows about the Armenian Genocide. This was legitimately, we're talking estimated 1.5 million Armenians killed because religion and race. And while I was reading that, I was absorbing the information and I was trying to make it an effort to understand why the Ottoman Empire might do that. There was no good reason. Because there is never a good reason for genocide, but genuinely, there was no good reason to kill 1.5 Armenian citizens. Like, genuinely atrocious that this has not been being taught in public schools, not just in America, but all across the world. This is for par, I would say comparable, definitely comparable to the Holocaust. I think this is one of the most awful events in human history. Just at least with like a mass extinction event like Pompeii. That's something that they couldn't control. Obviously, a tragedy, but there was no human error in something like that. This took so many fucking lives, such an insanely large amount of lives for fucking nothing. For fucking nothing. Fuck the Ottoman Empire, I guess I gotta say. I stand with the Armenians on this one. God damn, dude. Fuck. That sucks. And I've met a few Armenians in my life, and they have been some of the most enjoyable fucking people, and I never knew about their history. And that makes me feel bad now, because this is, quite frankly, one of the most disturbing Wikipedia articles I've ever had to read. But after reading it, I kind of feel like it's necessary for everybody to go through, spare an hour out of your day, and read about this shit. Because from what I can tell, not that many people know about it, and it is at least the second worst genocide in human history. So yeah, especially recent history as well. This was done in the 19th century, 1915 to 1920. That's fucking ridiculous. Fucking ridiculous. All right. I'm just still baffled by this story. I'm baffled by the information I just read. Sometimes it escapes my minds that humans are capable of doing shit like this, and yeah, it really fucks with you. It really, really fucks with you. It's just absolutely awful. Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you guys for absorbing the information. I'm very sorry that my reading was a little bit shoddy. Uh, I have dyslexia. Also, I have a little bit of a speech impediment, not like super bad. I've worked on it as a kid, but it still slips through every now and again. Sorry, I had trouble pronouncing some of those words. I'm not very good at reading foreign languages. If you made it all the way to this point, I really appreciate you sticking through and watching. Uh, wow. last thing to say, fuck the Ottoman Empire. Why did they do that? Why the fuck did they do that? Assholes. Jesus Christ. Alright. You guys have an amazing day. Hope it gets better after hearing that, because the Armenian Genocide. Well, it's not going to make your day better hearing about it, I'll tell you that much. Alright. Goodbye, everybody. Like, subscribe, comment your opinions. I'll reply back to pretty much all of them. Y'all have a great day, okay? Mwah.